And then we go back and we do the difficult reconciliation work of, in fact, balancing the anticipated revenues that we will have to operate the diocese over against the desire to spend money. And we come to that happy moment when the budget is technically balanced. And then that goes to Diocesan Council for their review and consideration in August of every year. And when they then vote to send the budget to the Diocesan Convention, and that's when it comes to be ratified on the floor of the convention. So one of the primary duties of our convention will be to approve, ratify the proposed budget. So we have published a document called the 2021 Narrative Budget, and it is a 21-page document available from the diocesan website. It contains both language about why the budget is the way it is and how we allocate out the funds. There's some pie charts at the end, one of which is not quite correct, but we can talk about that. And then at the very end, for those of you who really love numbers, in very teeny tiny print, we have the summary of the revenue and expenditure side of the 2021 budget. So did anybody get a chance to take a look at that 21-page document? Terrific. So that says everything that I know about the budget. It includes a letter from the bishop. It includes a letter from me as the chair of budget and finance, thanking all the people who worked on the budget and trying to provide some kind of a theme for the budget or how it differs from previous year budgets. And then it breaks it down into various groupings of how we expend our funds every year in the diocese. So I've talked about this budget as a bold budget for bad times. I don't think I need to argue the case that these are not that these are bad times. I think everybody would agree that 2020 is not going to go down as one of the better years of our lives, either collectively, certainly. And so you would think, given the economic difficulties, given some of the deep divisions that we've exposed because of the pandemic, we might in fact cut back our expenditures and have a more conservative budget. And in fact, I'll admit I would have proposed a more modest budget. But in fact, I think as Christians we're called to take bold stands, particularly in difficult times. And so this is a bold budget for bad times. So we're going to actually spend more money than we did last year, even though we are proposing that we won't get as much money in congregational assessments as we did this year, or we certainly did fewer congregational assessments than we did last year. And so the way we've balanced that budget then, to be transparent, is that we are in fact spending more of our reserve funds. And that's the part that makes me a little nervous. As chair of budget and finance, I'm supposed to be a belts and suspenders kind of person when I serve in this role as chair of budget and finance. And my concern is simply that you can tap into your savings once or twice, but you can't do it as a regular pattern because you spend more money than you save. So the reserves that we've built up over the last couple of years, we can spend them to sustain programs in 2021. The danger we run is that we won't be able to do it beyond that. And that's a risk that we are going to be taking in the coming year. Our increases are in a couple of important areas. We have increased our commitment to multicultural congregations, and we have made a big commitment to doing truth and reconciliation work, which is not work that we funded in the past, but your bishop and your executive team believe very strongly that one of our active responses to the difficulties we are facing as a country in terms of racial issues in terms of racism. So, I mean, I could go on about the budget because that's what one of my principal volunteer activities. But I just want to assure you that we are taking a risk. The risk is well supported financially. We are confident that we can do this. We've also committed to being very proactive in looking at how our congregational assessments go the rest of 2020 and then in the early part of 2021. So just if I could, to recap, in March, when the pandemic the reality of it really hit home, when churches were closed, the governor issued his various executive orders, we immediately put a stop to all unnecessary or all voluntary expenditures at the diocese. So we put a spending freeze. We cut the 2020 budget by 10%. And you might ask, well, how did you know to cut it 10%? And I will tell you honestly, that was just a sheer throw a dart at the wall. It might be 10% cut in the congressional revenues we were expecting. And then we tracked very carefully. We picked 14 congregations and we tracked their congregational assessments practically daily to see if there was going to be a significant diminution in the income coming into the diocese. And the reason that we focused on congregational assessments is because over 80% of the revenues to operate the diocese come from congregational assessments. So roughly speaking, 80 to 85% of the revenues come from congregational assessments, about 10% from dividends, and 5% from tuition and fees. So that's pretty much how we run the diocese. So what happens to congregations matters greatly to the diocese, and you may all know, I hope you all know by now, that the diocese operates on a real-time assessment system. So the monies that we get to operate the diocese that come from congregations are based on what the congregations took in the previous month. And the diocese gets 14.5% of the net disposable income from the previous month. So if congregations start having less money coming in the door for their budgets, the diocese almost immediately sees a diminution in its assessment revenues. So we monitored that. And one of the benefits of our federal government was that they included churches in the payroll protection plan. And 80% of our congregations applied for and received payroll protection plan funds, which gave 8 weeks of salary and benefits coverage to all those participating congregations. And so you may have strong feelings about the separation of church and state, but in fact, in this instance, we all happily put our hands out and monies came in from the federal government. And we hope that they really will be grants rather than loans, as they were anticipated to be. But that made a substantial difference in the revenues that our congregations enjoyed since March. And our third quarter financials for this year suggest that our congregational assessments are only going to be below budget by about 4%, which is remarkable in my view. And as you may know, if you follow the stock market, it has seemed to be in some alternate universe because it's doing remarkably well. It's backed off a little bit, but it's done much better. We had a drop in March, but we gained it all back by August, and there will probably be a little decline toward the end of the year. But all of our other indicators suggest that we will do quite well in 2020 and not be in difficult financial circumstances as we enter into 2021. What no one knows is how the various pledge campaigns will go in 2021, because they are just underway now. So we just simply don't know. So we anticipated a decline in congregational assessments for 2021 and are basically taking more money out of reserve to balance the budget and to be able to do the programs I talked about. We don't anticipate a lot of congregations will fail to make their congregational assessments. We have one or two congregations that are struggling, but very few out of the 91 congregations in the diocese, and we'll continue to monitor that. I would be happy to stop talking. Joel, did you have a comment or a question?
I do have a comment. I go to a fairly small church in Southwest Washington. Our experience with the 2020 pledges is that people paid their pledges. But what we were short on is plate gathering, because we couldn't pass the plate. And so we did come up a bit short. But overall, people were very generous and met their pledges by and large. What's happening now is the beginning of our pledge time. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the pledges hold up, given that we've been just meeting this way for quite some time now. So I don't know how our budget's going to shape up.
Right. Yes, Joel, thank you for that. Yes, those congregations that still had some significant portion of their revenue come from what we traditionally call plate. So if you are in, for example, a tourist area where you get visitors a lot, and typically they're not pledgers at your congregation, but they'll put money in the plate, not being able to pass the plate has been a challenge. The other difficulty congregations have had is those who rent space, and that rental income is a significant part of their overall budget. Organizations that can't meet, like AA or the Kiwanis, and some places have simply been unable to continue to pay their rent because they can't meet. That's been a difficulty for some congregations. So we will see more in 2021. And we are prepared to cut the 2021 budget if needs be as we go into the year. So there's a question here. How does the diocese respond to congregations who may be struggling to pay their assessment to ensure that they do not lose their status as being in good standing and thus lose the ability to vote at convention? That's an excellent question. So the canons require that congregations pay their assessment in full. And when that doesn't happen, when the congregation can't do that, my strong recommendation is they should immediately contact the canon to the ordinary if they're aware that they can't pay or pay as much as they can, but then to have a conversation directly with the canon to the ordinary to talk about the difficulty they're facing and what kinds of plans or remediations could they envision to be able to get back to their full assessment. But I would point out to us all that congregations pay 14.5% of their net disposable income from the previous month. So if you have less money coming in, your assessment technically declines because it's based on your revenue flow. Now, I understand that because congregations make commitments, particularly in the form of salary and benefits, you can't adjust those expenses, and you have other fixed expenses. And so what does sometimes happen is that congregations pay all the other bills in full and then don't quite get around to paying the diocese. But I think basically to avoid being not in good standing, what you need to do is have a conversation with the canon to the ordinary and the bishop, if needs be, to explain your situation and be as honest and transparent as you can. And talk about what ways you could modify your budget, what obligations you have that you can't change, and then congregations that don't pay their full assessment don't necessarily lose their ability to vote at convention. That's not an automatic decision. That's a determination made by the canon to the ordinary under canonical rules. And so I would urge you to have that conversation. I will say that for congregations that do have financial difficulties, the canons require that you go a full year with paying your full assessment before diocesan council can consider granting debt relief. I've served on the Budget and Finance Committee since 2012. I came on the committee after I was elected to diocesan council at the diocesan convention in 2012, and I became chair in 2013. And in that time, I think we've forgiven somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $800,000 in unpaid prior year assessments to congregations that simply couldn't pay them. So you can get forgiveness for those unpaid prior year assessments, but the first thing you have to do is have one whole year of sort of healthy financial behavior before we can consider granting relief. But we do that on a fairly routinized basis. George Robertson asked, how often does the council change the budget during the year? Well, almost never. We don't like doing that. We pride ourselves on trying to get the budget right the first time through. In my time on budget and finance, we've altered our budget during the year twice. So back in 2016, we went to diocesan council in June and said, we don't think we're going to spend all the money we budgeted in 2016. We'd like to alter the budget so that we can free up some of our reserves and apply them to the 2017 budget. And diocesan council agreed, and we in fact were able to do that. And then this year in 2020, in March, under the clear evidence that the world was changing because of the pandemic, we unilaterally cut the diocesan budget by 10%. And revised it then in March, and we have not changed that, even though our circumstances have improved, but we just left it largely because of the pandemic. People aren't going anywhere. So we anticipate that we'll end 2020 actually within the black. We don't think we're going to spend all the money we've budgeted even on the limited budget. Yes, Josh Hostler points out that at Good Shepherd Federal Way, we're planning our 2021 budget with the assumption that the quarantine will continue indefinitely. We assume and hope that we'll have to alter the budget mid-year as life improves. Is something like this likely on the diocesan level? Well, we're not planning on the quarantine ending soon, and so we've adjusted our revenues downward. The diocesan budget, however, is a little bit different from parish budgets in the sense that about 55% of our diocesan budget goes back to congregations. And so we don't think congregations are going to be asking for less help. That's why we have a bold budget, because they are bad times. Obviously, if the revenue stream improves, we could consider increasing some budget expenditures next year, but I'm not anticipating that we are going to have increased revenues. But I know that we have strong pressure on our expenditures. In some ways, the issue will be, can we continue to maintain the kind of support levels for congregations in 2022 if things don't improve on the revenue side for the diocese? And the revenue improvements on the side of the diocese are directly connected to revenues for congregations. 85% of what we spend comes from congregations and their budgets. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer. We may have to alter the budget mid-year in 2021, but my worry is that we'll have to cut expenditures to fit our revenues. And some of the money a lot of the money that we spend at the diocesan level is committed to supporting congregations, which you can't then turn around and say halfway through a grant cycle, oh, guess what? You're not getting any more money for your grant. Because congregations make their budgets predicated on getting grants, and we notify them once our budget is approved. So all the 2021 grants, some $250,000, I'm assuming people are planning on spending all of their grant. So it would be really difficult for us to say, oh, sorry, come March, your $5,000 grant won't be $5,000, it'll be $4,000. If we have unexpected additional revenue during the year, will we take less from the reserve funds? Yes. Basically, we spend the reserve funds at the last part of the year. So when we've emptied out the till, then we go to the piggy bank and we carefully crack it open and we pay the rest of the bills from the reserves, because the reserve money, by the way, is in the Diocesan Investment Fund. So it's working for us, earning more money, and we pay it at the end. Joyce Perry Moore says, do congregations pay assessment on grants, even those from the diocese or for clergy renewal programs? Diocesan Council addressed this a couple of years ago, and all grants from the diocese are exempt from your assessment calculation. They are deductible under your net disposable income. I don't know about clergy renewal programs. Not quite sure what you mean by that, Joyce. But so any diocesan grant is not considered part of your income and is off books. The Lilly sabbatical grants are outside money, so yes, they are assessable because they're outside money. But diocesan grants from the diocesan funds are not accessible. Joel.
Dennis, can I also point out that the assessment for the diocesan assessment has been substantially reduced over the past years, going from 20 down to 14.5%?
Yes, and it will remain 14.5% for 2022, largely because we don't know what the long-term impact is going to be about congregational assessment. I mean, how congregations are doing. And in the absence of any clear indicators, I mean, my heart goes out to my clergy colleagues who have been reinventing church while the airplane, this is like building an airplane while it's still in the air. The exhaustion factor must be substantial. And we just, from our perspective, it is so murky in terms of the longer term economic picture for this country. We're coming up on a major election. depending upon its outcomes, things could change substantially in terms of federal government intervention. Currently, the federal government is apparently uninterested in doing any additional kinds of economic intervention work, except in some selected areas of maybe reducing the taxes of the ultra rich. So we just don't know. So in the end, we said, we'll leave it at 14.5%. We would like to get it lower. And in point of fact, we could lower the diocesan assessment rate, but we would have less money to give to congregations in the form of grants. So when you give away 55% of your budget back to congregations, you could reduce the assessment rate for everybody, but then there would be fewer programs available to support congregations who are trying to do new ministry or need a little help and assistance to get along. Is there any evidence that new members are coming from distant places since the electronic dimension of parishes make new people available? I have had anecdotal evidence shared with me that people are getting funds from electronically connected members. Whether that will translate into the kind of pledge income that's necessary to run a congregation, I don't know. But people have reported getting checks or electronic funds transfers from people from far away. I can tell you that our beloved Camp Houston got $50,000 from two women who live in Nebraska who come to Camp Houston every year for a needlework or quilters retreat. And it's the highlight of their year. And they were devastated that they couldn't come because of the pandemic. And so they sent Bill Tubbs a check for $50,000. I haven't heard of any congregations doing quite that well, but it is entirely possible that new members will support the work. How substantial that will be, I don't know. And that's a function of individual congregations to incorporate those electronic members such that they are willing to participate in the financial life of the congregation. The bold budget. Can I say a few words about the categories that will be increasing and what's involved? It's Katie, it's available in the narrative budget itself, which is you can download or you can just look at it online. But three areas stand out for me. One is that we've made a modest increase in our communications and technology support. There you go. Josh Hostler just supplied the link, apparently. Thank you, Josh. So we're doing more with supporting congregations through their communications and technological stuff. I can tell you that we had close to $400,000 in requests for grants in 2021, which swamped our $250,000 allocation. And a lot of those were for technology support. We did have some small amount of money left over from the 2020 grant cycle, and we called those pop-up grants. And that all that money was given out during 2020, and a lot of it went for technology support. The biggest single increase in the budget is the work of truth and reconciliation. So we've devoted $100,000 to that work on anti-racism and truth and reconciliation work, which you'll hear more about at Diocesan Convention. But that's probably the biggest single shift in the budget. We also increased our support for the clergy residency program from $200,000 to $250,000, and we also made a modest increase in our support for multicultural congregations. Let's see. Jim Campbell writes, a clarification of the amount of reserve funds used to balance the budget the last 5 years. Almost zero has been needed in that time. So the reserves have continued to grow each year that the diocesan has had gains from the DIF. Yes, that's absolutely correct. And we've had years when we've had no gains from the DIF. And The reality that Jim is speaking to is that in the last 5 or 6 years, well, the diocese has not spent all the money that it is allocated to be spent in that year. So Jim and I have a friendly disagreement running about this because my view is that if you allocate funds to be spent, you have to anticipate that they will be spent. If at the end of the year they're not spent, then that money is swept up, taken out of the budget, and put back in reserves. But every year, when you allocate funds, $4.8 million, you need to anticipate that you can spend all $4.8 million because you've authorized somebody to do that. As it's happened, and Jim is absolutely correct, for the last couple of years, we allocate roughly $4.8 million and we spend 4.5. So we don't spend the reserve, and it's invested and it does grow. And we've also had a couple of good years for the Diocesan Investment Fund, and we are permitted by law to take some portion of our capital gains earnings and use them for operational expenses. But there have also been years in the last decade where we've had no capital gains. In fact, there was a couple of years in which we lost money. So you balance risk when you build a budget, and you try to come as close to perfect as you can. One of my goals as chair of budget and finance is to have $1 left in the diocesan operating budget on New Year's Eve. That would be a perfect budget. I've never gotten there. And some of it is because we set aside funds that we think we'll need to spend, and then we don't. And you don't want people going out and buying, frivolous things at the end of the year because they have money in their budget. So it's a blend of parsimoniousness and generosity. Yes, Joel.
I think that leads to a recognition of the staff of the diocese and how frugal they can be. Over the years, they have really kept an eye on spending and certainly not overspent at any point.
No, in fact, one of the things that Budget and Finance does is we look at the quarterly financials. So we don't necessarily look at monthly financial statements. We typically look at quarterly statements. And we look at them in terms of revenues. Are the revenues coming in as we projected? But we also look very carefully at expenditures, and we have a lot of line items in our budget because we are a fund accounting operation. And so monies are restricted in how they can be spent. So we have lots and lots of budget line items. And we track all of those. And sometimes there are timing variances, but we monitor them very carefully. And the staff have been, as Joel has said, marvelous. My favorite phrase is we budget generously, but we spend parsimoniously. And so that contributes to the problem that Jim Campbell points out, is that, we've got the money, why aren't we spending it? Well, this year we're going to do that because if you look at the sources of revenue, our carry forwards and fund releases, that's nonprofit accounting language for savings, has jumped to almost 17% of our total budget. And it should be, in traditional notions about budgeting, you would not be spending 17% of your budget out of your reserves. You would be much more cautious about that. So I commend the budget to you. There will be a couple of resolutions. I think at least one resolution before the convention about the budget. So I encourage you to look at that resolution in particular about setting aside a percentage of the budget for particular purposes. That's not something we have done in the past, but I would encourage you to read that resolution carefully because it will have budgetary implications. There will be a resolution at the convention about adopting this budget as proposed. It can be amended on the floor of the virtual convention, but there are complicating requirements that you should read carefully if you are inclined to propose a change in the budget from the one you see in the document. And we'll also adopt a resolution for the assessment rate for 2022, because that's required by canon that we do that 2 years in advance. So I'm happy to answer any questions about particular programs. Have I covered all the questions in the chat room? I don't see any remaining. Does anybody have any good jokes, recipes? How are people doing in this pandemic? Are the introverts doing well and the extroverts doing poorly?
Dennis, I thought your idea about the quarter keeping the bed vibrating was a good way to enhance the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Well, so one of the issues that's come up is do we need D-House in this new world? And I don't know the answer to that question. D-House has been closed since March. All the staff are working from home. They miss each other, I think. But we're not prepared to give up D-House just yet. And we're all trying to wait and see what's going to happen. So, but when we do, we will be delighted to have everybody come back.
Dennis,
Yes.
I looked online for a detailed line item budget and did not find one. Is there one on the website?
There should be. There's the 2021 narrative budget. If you want to get down in the weeds, I don't know. I thought there was a detailed copy, but if you send me an email, I'll get you as detailed a copy as I have. Yes, Sharon.
Just to expand on my earlier question, I've heard it said that even after the pandemic, things won't go back the way they are. And I read on the Diocesan newsletter or the bishop's encouragement that every parish have an electronic presence for their congregation. I was wondering, even once we all go back to church, a lot of people, since the electronic devices reach people who might not otherwise have been able to come to church in person or who are far away, it seems like a very fruitful place to move for the diocese and for the church to encourage reaching this new congregation now to support the pandemic times, but for the future as well. Has there been any discussion circulating around the future of the electronic congregation? And also people who have multiple parishes because of this, because I'm representing St. Paul's, but I also go to St. Mark's and St. Dunstan.
Yes, so there are conversations going on. Certainly the diocese has made a significant commitment to support the movement to electronic church for all congregations. To the degree that we have economic resources, we've been trying to deploy those. Josh Hornbeck, our canon missioner for communications, has been working closely along with Carrie Allman, our internet strategist. So congregations we're trying to give them as much help as we can on how to be an electronic presence. And that includes both helping them buy equipment, but more importantly, how to integrate that into their liturgical plan. The bishop is fully aware of this need, and he is now the chief steward for the diocese. And I think we'll be working on focused stewardship plans that include ways of reaching out to the people that you've not ever seen in the flesh, but are part of your virtual congregation. I know that there's a webinar coming up very soon, I think, for wardens and others about care of clergy, but I think that would be a good opportunity to talk about how we all can take advantage of this. I don't know of any knowledgeable studies about how people financially support organizations that they have visited online. Obviously, certainly I know at St. Mark's, there's an opportunity to donate on their website and to make it as easy as possible through, I don't know, PayPal or some kind of electronic format. But I don't know of any studies that say how that works in terms of garnering long-term support. But I would raise that question with the bishop and encourage clergy to be thinking about that. Certainly, in order to do that, you have to have a presence on various social media, and you have to keep up with your presence on social media. One of the less helpful aspects, if you go to a parish website and it has its Christmas schedule from 2019 on there, that doesn't bode well. So feeding your website, feeding social media is a huge issue, I think, for congregations, and one they need to think seriously about. So so I think it's pretty evident that all churches need to have some virtual presence. How that will play out, I think, will depend upon congregational culture and the energy level of clergy. I'm concerned about clergy burnout, doing online morning prayer, evening prayer, online this, online that. I don't know how that's going to work, but I think we're all going to learn, and we hope we'll have mutual conversations and try to share best practices with each other. So any other comments, questions, concerns, recipes, jokes, sermons? I look forward to seeing you all at Diocesan Convention. If any of you have any offline questions or something so particular that you didn't want to bring it up in this meeting, my email address is dtierney, DTIERNEY at ecww.org. And I would be glad to communicate with you via email offline. I hope this has been helpful to you all. Joel, thank you for joining us. And do read the narrative budget. There's a lot of information in there. I want to shout out a thank you to Josh Hornbeck and Greg Hessler and all the people at D House who turned a pig's ear of my work into a silk purse. When I read the narrative budget, I thought, wow, who did this work? It certainly wasn't me. But thank you all very much for coming. I hope if there are no other questions, or if there are, email me online, and we'll see if that older technology works better. But clearly, Zoom is tired, as maybe you all are. So thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you virtually at Diocesan Convention, and do make your pledge to the church of your choice. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Dennis. Bye.
Thank you, Dennis.